What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Adherent Apologetics. Thank you for joining us. Really excited for today's conversation. Today, I'm with Kyle Alander. He's from Christian Idealism. We're going to be talking about, namely, idealism. And what's up, Kyle? How you doing?
I'm good. Glad to be here.
For sure, bro. I think you're probably one of the smartest people out there. You always have those like crazy long syllogisms that you send to like our group chat and stuff. So
yeah, those syllogisms I get most of those from my other friend, Pessimistic Idealism, but we kind of work on them together. But yeah, I mean those because I've been working on newer arguments for idealism and also new arguments against physicalism as well. So I've been able to get like different types of arguments from different philosophers that existed today and those that existed in the past. So yeah, I mean, I feel like if I'm going to argue for idealism, I have to have really good arguments, right? Or if I'm going to argue against another position, I'm going to have to be more clear about what type of arguments I have, right? So that's what I pretty much do. I also have like physical art, like arguments from quantum mechanics is also a route that I typically go, though I think I had to be a little more cautious there because quantum mechanics is a whole big field and there's a lot of controversies. So I mainly just focus on the philosophical. I try to at least. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess definitely. And I'd encourage everyone, if you don't follow Christian Idealism, Kyle Alander, there's a link in the description below, so you can go sub to him. Really good stuff, man. So before we dive into the idealism stuff, can you just talk a little bit about like who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I started off on YouTube like probably 3 years ago, but I never really started actually making formal videos until much more recently. So I just kind of get a little backstory. So like probably like 5 or 6 years ago was when I started to really doubt my faith. And I was watching a lot of YouTube atheists at the time. Now, most of them, of course, were not as philosophically minded as like Graham Oppy, for example. Like, obviously, their arguments are not as good as like the actual arguments that atheistic philosophers use. But I was still challenged by the weaker arguments at the time. And I would say that if it wasn't for me finding Michael Jones's video or his channel, I would probably not have never gotten into it. So I thank Inspiring Philosophy for actually inspiring me to actually, do this sort of thing. And then it's weird because how should I say this? So when I first got into idealism, I didn't even know what philosophy of mind was at the time. Like I had no clue. Like I didn't even know what dualism was until after I figured out what idealism was. So it was something that, the first time I heard it, it was like, okay, well, I don't really understand what this means. So I just accepted it. And then, of course, then I learned about the other views. So there's substance dualism, there's property dualism, there's holomorphic dualism, then there's physicalism, and then there's different types of physicalism, which we'll get into later. There's also different types of idealism as well. But yeah, I guess when I first started off, I didn't really understand really anything. It wasn't until I really started looking into the scholarly literature that I had to, I guess, understand what I was studying. And so now I just do philosophy. Philosophy of mind is my major focus. I'm also getting into New Testament studies, but I still have a lot more to look into. So, I admit I'm ignorant on that subject, but when it comes to philosophy of mind, I wouldn't say I'm not a philosopher, of course, but I think for a layman, I've studied it pretty deeply. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd say for sure from what I've seen from you, a lot more philosophy of mind than I do. I barely know like anything. Like I'm kind of lost once we get beyond like idealism, physicalism, dualism. So I think it'd be helpful kind of at the start if you could just kind of define terms a little bit. So talk about like first off, what's philosophy of mind, and then talk about like the three main camps you have: physicalists, dualists, and idealists.
Okay. So philosophy of mind is the study of, the mind, right? It's not just about like the neuro. So we're not just talking, because like when we talk about neuroscience, right, we're studying the brain. Well, that's not technically the mind in the strict sense. When we're talking philosophy of mind, we're dealing with the mind itself, right? How we come to even understand the world. And I think if you're going to do philosophy of mind, you really need to introspect. So you can't treat philosophy of mind as like this abstract thing. It has to be something that's within your own mind. Like you have to introspect and really think about just your own mental states, right? So when you're thinking of something, like you have to think, okay, is this thought that I have, is this thought just some neuron in my brain, or is it or is it something completely different? And I think philosophy of mind, again, it's a very complex topic because there's a lot of terminology in there that can really confuse people. So there's three main camps in philosophy of mind. And these, of course, there's other views that I could get into, like just briefly mention them, was panpsychism and then cosmopsychism. So I'll mention those a little later. But the three main camps, you have physicalism or materialism, and there's different camps within that, right? But I guess if you were to unite all of physicalism, if you were to, describe it in one definition or something, the definition of physicalism is simply that all is physical, that the mind is simply just also a physical thing, and everything that we experience is physical. So it has one substance. It's a type of monism, so everything just is physical. Now, there's different, of course, there's subcategories within physicalism, but that's kind of the overall definition. And then dualism would be kind of going a little different. So dualism is where you have both the physical and this other category we call the mental. Basically, under dualism, you would say that there is a world outside, there's a world beyond my conscious experience, and beyond all conscious experience. But then there's still a consciousness, there's like this irreducible consciousness that you can't take mental states and then reduce them to that physical world that's out there, so to speak. I guess so basically under dualism, you have both matter and mind that are both fundamental in some sense. Like you can't reduce one to the other. And that's dualism. That's why it's called dualism, because there's two substances. Now, idealism is, again, there's a lot of categories within that. But if I were to unite all of idealism under one category, it would be that all that exists is the mental. Now, you may ask, well, how come we don't call it mentalism, right? Why is it called idealism? Well, the reason why it's called idealism is because under idealism, the whole world is basically an idea. It's a thought. So basically, all of reality is, you can call it either one thought or multiple thoughts, or it doesn't really matter. But basically, all that exists are just ideas or an idea. And basically, what an idea is just a thought. And of course, within a thought, if you have a thought, then you're also going to have consciousness, right? And so under idealism, you would say that consciousness is all that really exists in nature. And what I mean by consciousness, I'm not talking about your consciousness or my consciousness, but rather we're talking about the category of consciousness itself. So I can get a little more deeper into what I mean by that, but those are the three main camps. And then, of course, panpsychism. Panpsychism is kind of weird because you could be a naturalist and call yourself a panpsychist. So you could say that all of matter has like consciousness themselves. So basically, you can't really distinguish between matter and consciousness because, well, consciousness is like kind of like glued on to matter, so to speak. So like an electron, for example, has a certain consciousness to it. And then cosmopsychism is a little different. So that one's a little more complex, but basically under cosmopsychism, you wouldn't say that particles are conscious. Rather, you would say the universe as a whole is conscious. So it's a little different, but those are all of the mainstream positions out there. So
yeah, so I think let's start off with just kind of like talking about some arguments for idealism, because obviously you're an idealist, and then we'll kind of go into physicalism because that's probably the biggest. That's where most atheists would fall under. So let's just very briefly, if you were going to describe idealism to like a 10-year-old who has no idea about philosophy of mind or anything like that, how would you describe idealism to them?
So there's a few things we need to kind of keep in mind. So the first thing is to realize that idealism is not a type of solipsism. So under solipsism, you would say that it's only your mind that exists and that there is no external world beyond your mind. Mm-hmm. That is not idealism. So I just want to make that clear, because there's a lot of people that will confuse that. So when you say, because as an idealist, I'll say that all of reality is mental, but then they'll equate that with some type of solipsism, which it's not. So I guess to briefly simplify it, there is a world out there that exists outside of my mind, outside of your mind, outside of everybody's mind. So basically, there is an objective reality out there. Now, this is the catch. The objective reality that's out there is not a mind-independent reality. Rather, the objective reality that exists out there is what is called a transpersonal thought. Okay, so basically, everything that exists out there are just transpersonal thoughts. And what does that mean? Well, it simply just means that the outside world that's out there is still mental. It still has it's still the same category we would like we have thoughts, for example, right? Like if you think of the number 1 or the number 5, like those are thoughts in your mind. Well, in the same way, there are thoughts out there outside of our minds, but they are transpersonal because they don't exist inside of human minds. Rather, they exist in what's called you could call it God, or you could call it like an absolute mind or whatever. But there's a thought that exists. There's thoughts that exist out there in the world that are independent of my mind, independent of your mind, and that's basically just, you can call them mental processes or whatever. And that's pretty much it. I guess that's the simplest way I could describe what I guess the simplest way you could describe idealism. So, yeah.
So, yeah, it's a good basic description. We are going to be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you guys who are listening have questions, we'll hit some of them up at the end. But so I want to kind of like summarize your view because I'm very, very uninformed on idealism or any of these things. So in idealism, you have, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just like, so everything comes from our thoughts, essentially. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Not our thoughts, no. I would say that it comes from a thought. So you can call it God.
Okay.
You can call it like an absolute mind, or another way you can call it as something called immediate experience. Now that's kind of complex, but so I wouldn't say that the world comes from us, right? That we don't create the world. There's still an objective reality out there. It's just there's this mind out there that created the world. So again, you can call it God or not. It doesn't really matter. But basically, that all of reality is mental. That there is no reality that's outside consciousness. So everything happens within experience, essentially.
Mm. So I think one of the most common objections that you'd see intuitively is you'd be like, well, this computer that I'm looking at isn't mental, or that rock isn't mental, or like things like that. So how do you look at that as an idealist?
Well, I would say that what you're looking at, so actually, it's funny because I have an argument, I have a really long argument that basically shows that we have no justification, we have no good reason to think that there is a material world in that sort of way. And there's a lot of things so if I can go over it, but as an idealist, I don't really consider that a good objection, because the computer, the rock, that's still experienced, right? So that's still within experience. Like you can't conceive of something that's outside of experience, because that's an abstraction, right? You can't like if we're just taking our perceptions, for example, that's still perceived in a way that the physical world, it appears to us physical, and I could get more into that later. But the reason why I think the world looks to us physical is basically what's called, well, there's two different ways you could describe it. So the first way is you can go Donald Hopkins route, which he basically says that the physical world is basically just a fitness landscape. So in other words, they're just there to help us survive. But then another way you could go about it is to basically say that we're using the wrong language to describe material objects. So when we're talking about a computer or a rock, the reason why we think it's outside consciousness is not because it is outside consciousness, rather because we have a certain language that describes it as if it were outside consciousness. And so, again, go back to what I said earlier, which is basically that the world out there, so to speak, is still a thought. So that rock that you pick up, that's still an idea. That's still a thought, right? It still is created from some sort of mind, right? It just seems to us like it's outside. Now, it's true that, yes, that rock is outside of our minds. In other words, that rock is a transpersonal thought, right? But it's not something that exists outside of all minds, essentially. So that's the important distinction we have to draw. So
yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So a couple questions I have from that. So I'm guessing you would say that rock doesn't have a mind. This rock that we're theorizing about here.
No, I would say the rock is a thought, right? So it doesn't have a mind of its own, obviously, but it would have. Well, it's still a mental substance, essentially. So everything we experience is still mental, right? And I actually have an argument. It's called the causal closure argument, and it basically demonstrates that if causal closure is true, and if consciousness is irreducible, then idealism would also would just logically follow from those two principles. And basically, the idea is, if everything that interacts in the world is the same substance, and if consciousness cannot be reduced to something else, then therefore all that really exists are mental things. So I feel like you're talking about this rock. Obviously, it doesn't have a mind. We have a mind. But it exists in a sense in our minds because we're the ones that are perceiving it. But with that rock, you would also say has physical properties as well, right? Right, but I would say the reason why it has physical properties, even if we're just talking about physical properties themselves, I would say that physical properties are simply just the extrinsic appearance of mental phenomena, right? Again, it's still out there, so the rock still exists independently of whether you and I look at it. It's just it doesn't exist in a physical form, and this is something where I think quantum mechanics, I think physics itself has forced me into that direction. But yeah, so.
So would you say that with no mind, like if there was no mind, there'd just be no reality? Is that kind of where your view draws you to?
Yeah. So basically, if there's no foundation, or if there's no foundational mind that grounds reality, then there is no reality at all. So, yeah.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but I think one of the common questions you'd say is, what about before they were humans? Like, wouldn't there be no minds, so there would be no reality then? And I think I see a lot of issues with that reasoning, but that's something that I've definitely seen drawn up in conversations like this with talking of things like idealism.
Right. So that is a good, I guess, question. I wouldn't call it an objection per se, but let me see if I can, because I know Bernard Kastrup as well as other idealists have addressed this specific objection before. Let me see if I can find. Okay. So let's see. Okay. So this is so the objection, or I guess the question you just brought up, is called the cosmological history objection. Basically, that since the universe existed before conscious life arose, then it is implausible that the universe exists in consciousness. Now, the assumption is that consciousness, or raw experience, only arises with biology. However, biology is just the extrinsic appearance of personal psyches. It is not the origin of experience itself. There was universal consciousness before these alters arose, and it's plausible that due to fine-tuning, that universal consciousness had awareness to create life. So basically, I guess my response to that sort of thing is, again, there's still a reality outside of our mind. So of course there was, a world before we existed, right? It's just that world is still mental. That world still had transpersonal thoughts. And so, yeah, that's basically the idea behind it. So,
yeah, so I think this is a good transition because obviously, we're both theists, so we'd say that there was still a mind before we existed, namely God or the spirit, whatever you want to call
right.
Yahweh in the Bible. So let's talk about, we have this idea, and I think there's very strong arguments that would kind of debunk physicalism, which we'll get to in the next segment. But for now, how do we get from this idea that we have a mind, it can't be reduced to matter, therefore there's a greatest conceivable mind, or something along those lines? Like, how do we get to there?
Well, I think it's just I think it would just be an inference, right? So if all is mental, right, then there would have to be some sort of and again, I think this could go to the arguments for idealism, right? So I have a few of them. I don't know if you want me to go over some of them, but
you do have an argument for about everything, I feel like. So
yeah, I do. Well, not everything, but yeah. But
if you have like a short argument that you think will fit well, feel free to bring it in.
So okay, so let me see if I can find it. Okay, so I have one argument. It's called it's the introspective argument, but I kind of modified it a little bit to make it a little stronger than the original version. So it goes like this: Premise 1, experience exists. Premise 2, if there exists a physical world beyond experience, then there would be no observed correlations between states of experience and the brain. Premise 3, there are observed correlations between states of experience in the brain. Therefore, there does not exist a physical world beyond experience. Therefore, all is experience. Now, the only premise I really need to defend is premise 2. Mm-hmm. So this premise, I would say, is supported by 2 facts. So number 1, that subjective consciousness is purely privately accessible and examinable in terms of introspection. And then the second, I guess, fact I would say defends this premise would be that objective brain activity is purely a public accessible thing. It is not examinable by introspection alone. So I guess just to give you a little, intuitive way to think about it. So no matter how much you introspect, no matter how deep you think, you will never encounter one objective cell, one objective drip of water, or any objective neural activity. Such a thing would not even make sense, as it is a subjective examination of a subjective domain. Also, no matter how much you indirectly infer about my consciousness from the brain activity, you will never actually find one subjective dream mountain, one subjective illusion, or one subjective wild imagination in the brain. Such a thing will not even make sense, as it is an objectival examination of an objective domain. Thus, if there is a physical world beyond experience, then our internal worlds of consciousness are cut off from the external physical world. But yet, if the physical world is completely cut off world, then there will be no influence between these two things at all, and thus premise 2 just follows from that. So it's basically taking the idea that because there are correlations between brain activity and experience, but also because you can't describe one or the other, then therefore there has to be it all has to be within experience, right? Because again, we're talking about experience, so we're talking about our thoughts, right? So when we're introspecting, we are experiencing those thoughts, and then the same thing when we experience the physical world. That's all still experience, right? Mm-hmm. So why infer anything beyond that, right? Why infer that there's anything beyond experience? And I think the simplest explanation is that's all that really exists is experience. So yeah, it's a good syllogism as well. Transfer to physicalism. Also, I'm saying thank you, Fredo, for the super chat. We'll get to that question at the end. We are going to be doing some Q&A at the end as we transition here into talking about physicalism. I just want to say, if you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the show. You can support at patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics, or you can become a member or super chat, all that fun stuff. Let's talk about physicalism, because I think actually, one more question before we get into physicalism. Do you think that if idealism is true, do you think that it leads to theism and there's no way around that? Or could you be like an atheistic idealist or something along those lines? I think it's possible to be an atheistic idealist. I guess the best way to go about that would be you would have to accept like McTaggart's theory of. So he was an idealist, but he was also an atheist. So his hypothesis was that all that exists is not one universal mind, rather all that exists are persons, and these persons are basically eternal persons, and they just they interact in this complex system that we call reality. And so you could accept some form of idealism while also not believing in a universal mind. But then, if that's the case, I would just say that it's not as simple. It's not a simple hypothesis anymore, right? Because why, if why posit all these different minds, all these eternal minds, if we only really need one mind to explain everything? It just, it doesn't really make any sense. So yeah, I mean, you could. It's just I would say that I think it's ad hoc, but it is what it is. So
it is what it is. And ad hoc, and just for someone who doesn't know what ad hoc is, can you just explain that very briefly?
Yeah, just ad hoc means like you're positing more than you really need to. So like if for example, I guess a good quick analogy would be if something fell in my closet, like a box, I could assume that there was a cat in there, but then if I found no evidence for a cat, then why assume that there's a cat? In the same way, if there's, if there is a world out there, right, and if that world's mental, and if we can't control it, then there must be something that controls it, right? And the simplest hypothesis is simply that there's one universal mind that contains all those mental things. So, yeah.
Yeah, good stuff, man. So let's talk about physicalism a little bit. Let's just revisit the definition of physicalism again. So can you just talk about very briefly, like, what is physicalism again, in case someone forgot?
So yeah, physicalism is basically that all is physical, that even consciousness itself is either like a result of brain activity or it's like an emergent phenomena from the brain or whatever. So yeah, I mean that okay, so I guess if you were to compare it, basically say that there is a world outside of consciousness, and then consciousness comes from that world outside consciousness. So yeah, that there is a reality outside consciousness, and then our consciousness comes from whatever is outside consciousness. So that's physicalism for you.
So there's obviously a lot that can be said here about physicalism. So just I think at first it's very intuitive. Like before I study these things, it makes sense that consciousness comes from our brain. But take a few minutes to just kind of highlight some of the bigger problems that you see with physicalism and why you're kind of convinced that you think the theory just fails regarding philosophy of mind.
Well, the biggest problem with physicalism is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness is like, I don't really see how any physicalist could really solve it. Even in principle could solve it. So I guess just kind of highlight a few things with regards to that. So if you take a second and think about your own consciousness as if it is another thing, you cannot fully contain it in a single thought, because you are currently conscious of your own consciousness. So your consciousness extends beyond what you can know. In other words, you can never step outside of what it is to be conscious. All thoughts and experience happen in consciousness. So I guess that's just to point out that if there is a reality outside consciousness, we don't have access to it. Like there is no conceivable way to step outside our own experiences, right? So then it goes into things like, there's, okay, so just to highlight a few problems. So one problem I see with it is that, and this relates to the hard problem. So when you have a belief, like let's say if you have the belief that the Earth is a globe, right? That belief is in your mind. According to physicalism, it has to be in your brain somewhere, right? But we don't talk about brain function as if it were, as if they're true or false, right? We just talk about it as a function, right? So there's nothing in your brain that says that your belief in a globe Earth is true or false. There's this, again, if we're describing purely objective terms, we can't describe subjective phenomena through objective terms. And it just goes into absurdity. And then another problem related to that is what's called the location problem, which is basically that if all that exists is physical, then there must always be some sort of spatial location by which it exists, right? So like your computer says, let's just say that your computer is physical. So your computer exists in a particular space, so to speak. It exists somewhere. Well, thoughts, they don't actually exist really anywhere in our brain, right? So when you have a thought, you can't open up someone's brain and like find someone's thought. It's just pure nonsense. And then another thing I want to point out would be that, let's see. I'm trying to look at my notes real quick, but, Okay, so the hard problem, I would say, goes beyond what we can talk about. It goes beyond the functions of the brain, because we're talking about experience itself. Like, why does a particular brain function have to be accompanied by some type of experience? There's just no theory that can really link the two together. And then I also want to point out that I developed, well, I didn't develop the argument, but I kind of found it. So this is an argument that shows, I guess, that that theories which try to have subjects emerge from objects are fallacious. So let me just kind of briefly go over what I mean by this theory. So the subject is the aperture from which the object presents itself as an object for a subject. As such, it is more correct to say that every known object is not unconditional, absolutely independent, and externally related to phenomena in a knowing subject. Indeed, every object is always apprehended as an object for a subject. It is therefore impossible, in principle, for any theory to demonstrate how a subject can arise from a mere object which is absolutely independent of a subject. Because a mere object that is absolutely independent of a subject is not only absolutely inconceivable, but it is unanalyzable in principle. So again, if we're talking about a world beyond experience, you can't actually examine someone's brain as if you were examining it outside of experience, right? So again, I guess it goes back to the whole concept that you can't, it's basically like, it's like you're trying to take nails and trying to make a cake from nails. Like, you just can't do it. There's just there's no way logically conceivable you can do it. And then I also have an argument for why any theory which tries to get an object from a subject a subject from an object is fallacious. So premise 1, an object's features are either subjective relative or subjective independent. Premise 2, an object's subjective independent features have their conceptual content grounded in the object's subject related features. Conclusion, therefore, an object's features are either subjective relative or have their conceptual contents grounded in the object's subjective relative features. Premise 3, the only way to explain the emergence of a subject from an object would be to explain the emergence of a subject from an object in terms of the object's subjective independent features. Therefore, the only way to explain the emergence of a subject from an object would be to explain the emergence of a subject from an object in terms of features that have their conceptual contents grounded in the object's subjective relative features. Premise 4, to explain the emergence of a subject from an object in terms of features that have their conceptual content grounded in the object's subject relative features is viciously circular. Therefore, the only way to explain the emergence of a subject from an object is viciously circular. If an explanation is viciously circular, then it is fallacious. Therefore, the only way to explain the emergence of a subject from an object is fallacious. So it's basically, you just can't, I know that argument is probably really hard for most people to understand. But it's basically just demonstrating that you can't take something that's independent of an object. So in other words, we can't talk about a physical brain in the physicalist sense, because if we're talking in terms of physicalism, we have to assume that there's this brain that exists independent of subject. And then we can't say that that thing that's independent of a subject can give rise to an actual subject. There's always going to be, any explanation you give is going to be viciously circular. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. There's so much information that you're bringing here, Kyle, and I'm thankful for people like you that know this stuff because I don't know a lot about this topic. So I'll throw a couple of more common objections that I see at you, and then we'll kind of go to the live chat and we'll kind of wrap things up here. So I think obviously the biggest objection that we see whenever we try to go beyond physicalism is the idea of the brain. Like we only have this idea of conscious experience with our brains. Like I wasn't conscious before I was born, or I wasn't conscious until I think it's like 6 or 7 months after you're conceived that you start to have conscious experiences. So it seems like consciousness comes through the brain. So wouldn't consciousness just come through the brain then?
Well, no, because again, we're talking under idealism. The brain is the extrinsic appearance of consciousness. So basically, consciousness is fundamental to the brain. So it's not like the brain started off unconscious and then somehow created our consciousness, right? Rather, our brain is basically the extrinsic appearance of our well, this is probably not the best way to say it, but basically our disassociated consciousness in our life. Because if everything's if everything's consciousness, right, then we would basically be disassociated alters, basically like cut out, or some people call it submergence, but that's a whole complex other topic. But you have to think within the logic of idealism. So in the logic of idealism, we would expect there to be correlations between the mind and the brain, because the brain is the extrinsic appearance of your conscious inner life. Right?
What does that mean? Just in case someone's like, what's that? It mean that your brain's the extrinsic appearance?
It's what your brain activity, I guess it's what your mental activity looks like from a third person perspective, basically. Because if everything's mental, then I guess you could say that everything is kind of like, that everything in the universe is sort of mental activity, right? And then when we look at that mental activity, that's what the physical world is, what mental activity looks like from a third person perspective, which is from our perspective, right? And then it's the same thing when I look at your brain. I am looking at your conscious inner life from my perspective. Now, of course, from your perspective, it's different, right? Because you're the subject itself. But from my perspective, because I'm not you, I'm going to be seeing it a little differently. And so you could say, I guess, if you were to simplify it a little bit, I would say that the universe, when we look out in the universe, we're seeing the extrinsic appearance of non-disassociated conscious inner life. And then when I look at someone's brain, I'm looking at a disassociated, or the extrinsic appearance of a disassociated conscious inner life. So because again, everything's mental, right? So everything we look at is gonna represent. It's gonna be a representation of mental processes, right? But of course, when we're looking at a brain, that's a different type. It's still mental, but it's a different type of mental activity. So that's basically how it all works.
So one last question here, and then we'll probably go to some Q&A. So what about brain damage? Because I think this is one of the most common things that you'll see bringing up is, someone has some sort of like brain damage and all of a sudden their conscious experience changes. So conscious would seem to be, from a physicalist perspective, almost through that objection is what people would argue. So how do you look at things such as like brain damage?
Let me see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I actually have this in my notes. So, like you brought up, we know that head trauma and the use of drugs can highly influence and change how one's conscious inner life is. And so evidence prefers that there is something outside conscious. So that's the objection, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I just want to make a few points clear on this. So number one is that private minds are disassociated alters of universal consciousness. And the world around us is also the extrinsic appearance of universal consciousness. However, there is something that alters look like from a second point of view, and this would be the brain. Since the brain is limited and only has, it has this sort of boundary, right? Then it is the extrinsic appearance of localized, disassociated aspect of universal consciousness. Now, again, outside of all the alters, so outside our minds, there's still a reality out there, right? Now, any physical interference with the brain is the extrinsic appearance of mentality external to an alter that disrupts the inner experience of the altar from a causeless boundary. To make it more intuitive, so this is kind of like an intuitive way to think about it. So our thoughts always disrupt our emotions and vice versa. And on a daily basis, for the same reason that thoughts disrupt the emotions, then physical interference with the brain disrupts and alters inner life. And since everything is mental, right, then this is what we should expect. Because again, if everything's mental, like if the world out there is mental, then if transpersonal thoughts hits my brain, guess what? It's also mental. So of course it's going to affect it. Just in the same way that, our thoughts will disrupt our emotions and our emotions will disrupt our thoughts. Different types of thoughts can have different effects on different thoughts. So too, transpersonal thoughts will have an effect on our thoughts because it's both the same substance. They're both fundamentally, they're both the same thing. The only difference really is that the world out there are transpersonal thoughts, and then the world, in our minds are basically, our personal thoughts. So, I mean, I never really understood that. I think if someone's going to make that type of objection, they don't really understand what idealism is. And honestly, I think that's probably like one of the worst objections because it just has a fundamental misunderstanding of what the position actually says. So I guess just to kind of summarize a little bit. So just as the universe is the extrinsic appearance of universal consciousness, so is the brain also the extrinsic appearance of someone's inner life. And if all is in consciousness, then only mentality can interfere with mentality. So again, if everything is mental, then, of course, transpersonal thoughts out there are going to affect my thoughts. So yeah.
Well, I think you just got debunked because Stillman says all the evidence supports physicalism, every bit of it.
Yeah, sure.
We just wasted 40 minutes, I guess. One last thing that I'm going to throw in here before we go to some Q&A. I get a lot of comments on TikTok from physicalists. So if you had 200 characters to say why physicalism is wrong, what would you say?
Well, I mean, I have a few arguments that would be more than 200 characters, but I would just say that you have to look at, I guess, my biggest, other than the hard problem of consciousness, my other big issue with physicalism would be that when you compare it to idealism, it's just really bad. So, it's kind of like you have to assume that there's something out there that's outside of experience. And then on top of that, you also have to assume that that thing that's outside of experience that we have no access to is somehow generating our experience. So it's just a vicious abstraction. It's just just a vicious abstraction. So yeah, I'll just refer them, I guess, to the hard problem and then kind of break down sort of why the theory itself is just completely absurd once you think about it more. So yeah.
Good stuff. Let's go to some Q&A. We'll probably see if you guys have questions or thoughts you want to grill Kyle. Go for it. We probably have like 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A. First question, a super chat from Sehefredo Serabia says, if mental process of individuals, why no sophism? Do you know
Solipsism, yeah. Let me see here. So idealism does not accept. Okay, so I just want to make this clear that idealism does accept that there is a world beyond our minds, right? The only difference is that the world beyond our minds the world beyond our minds or personal psyches is either other minds, so it's, in other words, is like other minds out there, or universal consciousness itself, by which the whole universe is the extrinsic appearance of universal consciousness. So the reason why it's not solipsism is, again, there's still a world out there. It's just that world out there is still mental. And that's what we need to keep in mind, that there is an objective reality out there. It's just that objective reality is still mental. It still has the same. It's basically the world out there is still fundamentally the same. It's the same type of world within our own minds. Like, we have thoughts, right? It's just the world out there. There's also thoughts. There's transpersonal thoughts. So that's basically the idea.
Another super chat. Thank you for the super chat from Hifredo. He says, if there's something outside consciousness, what's fundamental if no longer our mind is dependent on it? Is it not having access unjustifiable if it's mental?
I don't know. What does he mean by trying to understand what isn't having access?
I think he's talking about like the idea that there's no empirical evidence of something beyond the brain producing consciousness, maybe. Like a lot of times you'll see like, there's no evidence for the soul.
Well, here's the thing we need to understand is we can't have metaphysical certainty, right? So I admit that idealism could be wrong. There could be a world beyond consciousness, right? We're never going to have metaphysical certainty. There's always going to be this sort of uncertainty in regards to the ultimate nature of reality, right? So I do admit that there could be a world outside consciousness, right? But the question is it simple? Like, is that a good hypothesis? And I don't think it is. I think once we really think about it, I don't really see why we don't need to posit a world outside consciousness. If we can explain everything in terms of consciousness, I don't really see why we need to infer something that's beyond consciousness. And not only that, but I mean, even if there was something beyond consciousness, we couldn't really know about it. We couldn't have access to it. So I just, I mean, if you want to posit a world outside consciousness, that's fine. But I just don't. I think it's just more simple to go with that all that really exists is consciousness. So, yeah.
Next question, another super chat from Sihifredo. Thank you so much. Says, if you say something can't be reduced to matter, how can you be an idealist, much less Christian, without dualism that's evidence that there are physical things?
Well, okay, so let me. This is interesting. This is an interesting question because there is a type of idealism that could be compatible with dualism. And the basic idea would be like, it would go like this. So under idealism, the fundamental nature of reality is consciousness. Now, let's just say that's true. However, we could also say that there is a physical world, right? But this physical world is strongly emergent. So it's kind of like taking a strong emergent approach and then like turning it into an idealist position. So under physicalism or under a physicalist strong emergent, you would say that the physical is fundamental and then the mind is strongly emergent. Or you could also say under idealism that the mental is fundamental and then the physical world is strongly emergent from this fundamental mental thing. And I think that is an interesting position to take because I would actually say that pretty much most Christians that aren't idealists are probably some form of what's called a strong emergent idealist, where we basically say that the fundamental nature of reality is God, or in other words, it's just a mind, right? But then the physical world that we experience is strongly emergent from that fundamental mental reality, which we call God. And I would say like pretty much anyone that's a Christian but also doesn't call themselves an idealist would probably fit into that camp, where you basically say that matter as we perceive it cannot be reduced to mind. So in other words, that matter is not the extrinsic appearance of mental activity, but rather matter itself could be strongly emergent from mental activity. So in other words, that the world is still contingent on God. So basically the world can't really exist without God being there to give it existence, in other words. So that's an interesting view that I think, I guess, kind of bridges the gaps between the substance dualist and the idealist like me. Is I think a good middle ground would be to say that there is a physical world, right? And this physical world, we cannot reduce this physical world to the mind, but this physical world is still strongly emergent from the mind of God. And I think that's a good approach to take.
So Ramon the Large says, I always hear atheists bring up this argument about how if you cut the brain in half or do damage to it, it should damage the soul as well. I guess we kind of talked about this earlier, but if you have any additional thoughts, what are your thoughts on this, Kyle?
Well, again, I mean, just talk about what I went earlier with brain damage. I mean, of course, if you damage the brain, you're going to damage the mind, because you're basically taking a transpersonal thought, which is a physical object, and then affecting someone's mental mind, if you want to call it that. Because again, if everything's mental, then of course we should expect the mental affect the mental, right? I think we just need to understand that the physical world out there is itself mental, and I think once we understand that the physical world out there is mental, then we should expect that brain damage will affect the mind in some way, because that's just again, we have to think within the logic of idealism. If we think in terms of idealism, then idealism predicts that brain activity is going to affect the mind, and that includes split brain patients and all that other stuff. So yeah.
JMD Apologetics says, why does Kyle take theist words over scientist words?
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Who cares what that John Dunphy guy has to say? He takes man's word over God's word. So there's a couple questions about how this would affect the incarnation. I don't know if you have any views on this, but it talks about if God is simply a mind, then what did he take on in the incarnation?
Well, it's funny because this is actually related. So I think the incarnation has more to do with redeeming us from sin, right? So I think the incarnation has to do more specifically with saving mankind from sin, right? So that's a whole different topic, which we could get into at another time. But I think I still, for example, I still would accept that you still need the Son of God in order to save mankind from sin. Now, what is sin? Well, if you want to understand my concept of sin, if you go to my channel, I have a quantum hermeticism series, and there's videos number 8 as well as I think 16. If you watch those videos, you'll understand that sin, I think, has to do with what's called fractured consciousness, which I'm not going to get into now, but I have a whole metaphysical way of kind of explaining the fallen state and all that other stuff. And I do think that you would need the incarnation, because God would basically have to take on some human nature in order to, I guess, make the bridge between us and God. So I didn't really explain the incarnation in the video, but if you want to understand, I guess, kind of the some of the metaphysics behind it, you can watch those videos. So yeah.
Yeah, if you aren't subscribed to subscribe to Christian Idealism. There's a link in the description. Really good stuff from Kyle. Really smart guy. Has an argument for everything. Question here from Nick Quinn. What's up, Nick? He says, "But what if the New Testament teaches physicalism?"
Well, I don't think it would, because again, we're talking about a fundamental mind like God that created reality. So if God is the foundation for reality, if reality can't exist without God, if God created the world, I don't really see how that's physicalism, right? Because you still have fundamental mentality, right? And that would be God. So I mean, here's the thing. There are some interesting arguments for physicalism, but it has nothing to do with God, right? So it has nothing to do with whether God's consciousness came from something else. Rather, it has to do with whether or not human consciousness came from something else. And again, there are some pretty interesting arguments for that. But I think all those passages are better explained if we talk the mind in terms of the ego. So in other words, if we're talking about the soul, we're talking about someone's emotions, thoughts, feelings, etc., as well as memories, right? But we're not talking about their consciousness themselves. So we're not talking about the conscious mind. Rather, we're talking about the ego or the soul, which is someone's personality, someone's thoughts, emotions, all those things. So yeah, I mean, I am aware that there are some Christian physicalists out there, right? But I think those passages, again, can be better explained if we make a distinction between the conscious mind and the soul. So yeah.
Some random says, put someone in an fMRI machine and you can see the neurons firing. So I think it would kind of be like an argument that consciousness comes as a emergent state of the brain.
Yeah, I don't. Again, you can't infer causation from correlation. So yes, there are correlations between someone's neurons and someone's mental activity. But again, if you think within the logic of idealism, we would expect that, because the mind, or in this case, the brain, is the extrinsic appearance of the mind. So when I'm looking at your brain or your neurons, I'm looking at the extrinsic appearance of your conscious inner life. So, yeah.
Stelman Smith Jr., the Unapologetic Apologist. Shout out to him. Go subscribe to the Unapologetic Apologist if you haven't already. He says Sam Harris wrote about the possibility of a 3-day-old fetus possessing a soul. And if it splits into twins, does the soul split into two? Then he says that souls don't make any sense.
Well, I think we need to understand what. So I make a distinction between. I do the same thing Michael Jordan does, which is there's a distinction between a conscious mind and a soul. So a soul is something that grows over time. So a fetus, right, doesn't really have. I mean, it has a soul, but not in any developed sense, right? So if there was two twins that split, they could. I think they split the same. I guess you could say that they had the same conscious mind, but then it kind of split into two, right? And then of course the soul, they could develop different types of souls because they're still two different people. So I would have to think about that more, but it is interesting that I do think it's possible to, I guess, split a soul or split a conscious mind in that way. So yeah, but I wouldn't really see how. So again, I don't think Sam Harris really understands what we mean by soul, because when we're talking about souls, we're not talking about the conscious mind, so to speak. We're talking more about like someone's personality, emotions, feelings, and all that stuff. So yeah.
Some random says earlier you're talking about not using ad hoc arguments, but that's exactly what you're doing.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I have an argument that's like 40 premises long, and that's just no.
If you think that Kyle is ad hocing this, please Facebook message him or something, because Kyle has an argument for like everything. Let's close with this question, if I can find it. It was really a question, just kind of like recommending resources, because obviously there's a lot of information you brought up here. Can't find it. But the question was like, for someone who has no idea about this philosophy of mind stuff and wants to look into it, what are some of the resources you recommend? It was a question from Benjamin Bethel. Thank you, Benjamin.
There's a lot of books I recommend. So just to get into general philosophy of mind, I would say this book by David Chalmers, The Character of Consciousness, and then The Conscious Mind by the same author. Now, I would recommend you read this one first and then the next one, but it doesn't really matter. And then I would also recommend Mind and Cosmos by Thomas Nagel. And then if you want to get to arguments for, actually, I have 3 books on idealism. So you got this one, which just came out like a few years ago. It's called Idealism, New Essays in Metaphysics. And then you got The Idea of the World by Bernardo Kastrup. And then you got The Case Against Reality by Donald Hoffman. And then another really good one, which I actually didn't finish yet because it's pretty big. It's called The Irreducible Mind. Now, I'm not sure if they're idealists, but they do critique a lot of the theories in neuroscience, at least the physicalist theories in neuroscience. And if you want to, I guess, understand why physicalism has problems even within neuroscience, you can read this work and understand, I guess, the arguments and the type of evidence that would make physicalism problematic. But yeah, those are my main resources. So yeah.
Yeah, Kyle, lots of great stuff you bring up, man. Really appreciate this time. Any kind of like last thoughts that you want to bring up before we wrap things up here?
No, I mean, I guess just, go to my channel, watch some of my videos. If you have any questions, let me know. I mean, again, I have, the arguments that I presented today are only a tiny fraction of the large amount of arguments that I have for idealism. So I have about 18 arguments for idealism. Now some of them aren't exactly arguments for idealism, but they do argue like against the reality of space and time. But most of them are direct arguments for idealism, which I didn't get into today because take way too much time. But there are really good reasons to be idealist, and I think I recommend everyone if you have any questions, again, just let me know. Watch my videos, and so yeah.
The great philosopher of mind, Tom Jump, once said, "Google it." So.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Kyle. Great stuff, man. I'm going to be sure to share your channel on all my social media stuff because you have some really good stuff. Really smart guy. Go check out Christian Idealism, Kyle Alander. Thanks for doing this, Kyle. Really appreciate your time, man. Learned so much in just such a short amount of time.
All right.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. This is Adherent Apologetics. I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoy us, please be sure to subscribe. You can leave a like. If you enjoy us, you can support us at patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics for as little as $1 a month. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. Some random, Kelvy, the Unapologetic Apologist, Benjamin Bethel, and Fredo for super chats. That's it. Have a good one, guys. God bless.